And welcome back to our discussions on Brown laws. We are now ready to start with the second part of Brown laws, lesson 2, which would focus on managing solid waste. So in this lesson, we will focus on basically one law, and that law is the Solid Waste Management Act of 2000, otherwise referred to as Republic Act number 9003. All right, so with that said, let's jump right in and let's discuss essentially the law. And we're going to look to answer 3 questions. What is this law about? How does it provide? And what are the punishable acts? So let's start with the very basic, so we have a clear understanding. Let's try to understand what this law is all about. So let's try to answer that now, okay? What is this law about? In essence, it's really all about controlling solid waste. So the law therefore provides, for an ecological solid waste management program. Okay. Now, that gives us a general idea as to what this law is all about. But I think we need to just dig a little deeper just to give us a better understanding, okay, of what exactly we're referring to here when we say solid waste that needs to be controlled. What are we referring to here when we say ecological solid waste management? Okay, so let's see if we can get answers to those, follow-up questions. Let's start with defining what solid waste is. Okay, solid waste, according to the law, refers to the following. Okay, it refers to actually a number of things. It enumerates them, like commercial waste, construction debris, non-hazardous institutional and industrial waste, street sweepings, agricultural waste, waste that's discarded from household, and lastly, other non-hazardous, non-toxic solid waste. So this last one actually kind of brings up another question. Okay, what then are solid waste? Or what are things that are not included in the definition of solid waste? So let's quickly look at that, all right? Solid waste, what it does not include. The law talks about 3 types of waste that is not considered part of solid waste in this context, okay? First, it talks about waste identified or listed as hazardous waste of a solid, liquid, contain gaseous or semi-solid form, which may cause or contribute to an increase in mortality or specifically death, or in serious or incapacitating reversible illness, or acute chronic effect on the health of persons and other organisms. So it's really talking about these hazardous wastes, okay, that are known to not only make people sick, okay, not just people but organisms. Okay, but it may even cause death. Okay, those types of waste are not included in the way solid waste is defined by this law. What else? Okay, infectious waste from hospitals. Okay, and it enumerates some examples of what is considered infectious waste from hospitals. So it talks about equipment, instruments, things of those sorts that are suspected to have or have been used on patients, okay, who are diagnosed with communicable diseases, okay, like for example, COVID patients. I guess the instruments that are used on COVID patients, that's when those need to be disposed. They don't just throw them in the trash can, okay. They need to be disposed of differently, and that different means of disposable is not included in this ecological solid waste management program. Okay, some of the other things included in infectious waste from hospitals are disposable fomites that may have harbor or transmit pathogenic organisms. I mean, basically what it's referring to there is things from labs, laboratory wastes. Okay, so there's a number. So essentially, there's about 3 different categories that it's talking about here but in all respects, they are all waste from hospitals, not just regular waste, but infectious waste from hospitals. Okay, so what else? Waste resulting from mining activities, which include contaminated soil and debris. Okay, so now let's proceed to define what solid waste management is. The law refers to solid waste management as that discipline associated with the control of solid waste in terms of generation, storage, collection, transfer and transport, processing, and disposal in a manner that is in accord with the best principles of a number of things: public health, economics, engineering, conservation, aesthetics, and other environmental considerations. As well, it is responsive to public attitudes. All right, so this definition, along with the earlier definition when we started to talk about what solid waste is, if you were to combine those and take from it, you are actually going to be able to define exactly what ecological solid waste management is. And in fact, that's exactly how the law defines it. It took from these two definitions to come up with a legal definition of what ecological solid waste management is. So let's talk about that. Okay, this is what the law says as to what ecological solid waste management is. It says it is the systemic administration of activities which provide for segregation at source, segregated transportation, storage, transfer, processing, treatment, and disposal of solid waste and all other waste management activities, very important here, which do not harm the environment. Okay, so the last sentence sort of refers back to how solid waste is just confined to those non-hazardous types of waste, right? Because the idea here, when we are talking about ecological solid waste management, is that the activity does not harm the environment. Okay, so there you have it. Now we have the definition that we need. I think at this point, it's a little clearer to us as to the solid waste that needs to be controlled. It's a little clearer to us what we mean by ecological solid waste management, since again the law talks about providing for an ecological solid waste management program. So having made those conclusions, I think it's now we're now better positioned to move on to the next question of how does it provide. So let's go ahead and do that. So in this section, or this part of our discussion, we're going to look to three areas provided in the law that describe how this program, this ecological solid waste management program, is how it aims to deliver on its objective of controlling solid waste. So there's three areas, as I mentioned, in the law that are identified, and we'll look at each one of them, not in great length, but just look at them enough to understand exactly what specifically they do in relation to controlling solid waste management, okay, or controlling solid waste. All right, so the first thing that we see in this program is a section that focuses on the institutional mechanism, and then there's also a focus on the comprehensive solid waste management plan or program itself. So this is also very similar to how the earlier laws in Brown laws are put together, or at least the focus, the methods or approaches that they're taking, which necessarily includes some kind of an action plan. So it's no different here with the ecological solid waste management programs under this law. Okay, so after that, then there's some rules. Actually, they're specific to particular activities. So we'll look at each one of these activities and what rules this law provides so it can be effective at controlling solid waste. Okay, so that said, let's proceed. Let's begin to focus our attention on the first one, on institutional mechanism. So in an institutional mechanism, it really gives us an idea of all of the entities that may play in to this objective. Okay, and there are a number of them, and we'll look at the first one that's listed. It's the National Solid Waste Management Commission. Now, this commission was specifically created by this law. Okay, it reports into the Office of the President. It's kind of a who's who of participants. There are 14 heads of government agencies that are members, as well as 3 from the private sector. The government agencies, the participants, the 14 that I speak of, as I said, they are heads of the various agencies, including, DENR, the Department of Interior and Local Government, or DILG, the Department of Science and Technology, so that's DOST, Department of Public Works and Highways, okay, that's DPWH, and a whole host of others. There's DOH, DTI, and the Department of Agriculture. So there's quite a number that I won't mention. But in addition to these national government agencies, the League of Provincial Governors are also members, League of City Mayors, League of Municipal Mayors, including Association of Barangay Councils. Okay, TESDA is also among the 14 government entities, and lastly, the Philippine Information Agency. Okay, on the private sector side, there's a representative from the NGO, the non-government organization, and the purpose of that NGO their principal purpose is to promote recycling and the protection of air and water quality. Okay, there is also representatives from the recycling industry and the manufacturing or packaging industry. Okay, so that kind of gives you an idea of how this commission is organized. Okay, so let's proceed. Let's take a look at what else is discussed here on the National Solid Waste Management Commission in terms of its organization. Okay, there's also a provision that allows it to, as necessary from time to time, to call on other concerned agencies or sectors, to partake in its efforts, again, as it may deem necessary, right? Now, in terms of its duties and functions, or powers and functions, there's a number, and let me just give you a short list. The first that I'm going to show you is one that talks about the preparation of national solid waste management framework. So very much alike, or very much like that in the earlier laws that we looked at, the other Brown laws. It's a framework that, of course, is critical in producing some of the action plans that everybody uses as a blueprint for their activities. Okay, so in this area of preparing the National Solid Waste Management Framework, they also play into approving the waste management plans that are created by the local executives. Okay, they also have a responsibility of not just reviewing, but probably more importantly, monitoring the implementation of these local solid waste management plans by local executives. Okay, so what else? They coordinate the operation of local solid waste management boards. So there's, this speaks of multiple boards, okay, that are partly involved in controlling solid waste. So this commission is the central coordinator in terms of the operation of those various boards. Okay, what else? They also provide some assistance, to local governments. So the local governments are not on their own. As well, they adopt programs and provide technical and other capability building assistance and support to local government. Okay, so its function isn't just to create policies, but to also assist in the implementation of those policies. Okay, which necessarily includes capacity building and the like. All right, what else? Develop a mechanism for the imposition of sanctions. So this is an interesting one because this is basically the body that would create punishable acts or unlawful acts from which you, as an investigator, if you were to pursue that line of work, you would be looking at their resolutions, their outputs, their issuances to help you determine what they have established to be unlawful acts. And of course, that's also going to be your source for the elements of offenses. Okay, what else? Develop and prescribe procedures for the issuances of, okay, so it's talking about the rules on issuing permits and clearances. And in a way, this already hints that those are essential requisites for some activities that in the absence of, there would be a violation, right? So this, as an investigator, would be a hint to you as to what this body does in that area. Okay, so they develop and prescribe procedures for the issuances of permits, which necessarily, obviously creates or necessarily involves the setting of the limits, and those limits are essentially the basis for whether something is violated without a permit. Okay, so moving forward, what's the last one here? Formulate the necessary education, promotion, and information campaign strategies. So of course, that's an essential part of pretty much every initiative involving environmental protection. So, no different here. Okay. So the next on our list is the National Ecology Center. Okay, this entity is one that belongs under the Commission, and its purpose is to provide consulting, information, training, and networking services, specifically as it relates to the implementation of this law. Okay, so that is their role. Next is the DENR. As we know, the DENR is the lead agency on anything that deals with the environment. So naturally, they would also be the lead agency in controlling solid waste. And being that that's the case, they play into the commission as the chair of that commission. So that's one of the responsibilities or functions and powers provided by this law. Okay, others include the annual national solid waste management status report. Okay, this is a similar activity, almost identical activity actually, to that's done on the clean air or clean water. Okay, and the report, these annual reports are naturally intended to assess the situation at that point in time, provide some some findings on what issues there might be, and so on and so forth. Basically, it's a means to collect valuable data. Okay, and that data doesn't just sit in some filing cabinet. It provides as a basis for a number of things, of which includes those materials that the DNR prepares and distributes, information, education, and communication materials. The findings from the status reports, in a way, could serve as a basis for what would be the contents of the information, education, and communication that the DNR would be preparing and distributing. Okay, so not limited to that, there are other essentially any of the players, perhaps in the commission, would definitely benefit from the findings of these status reports. Okay, so what other functions and powers would we find of DENR in relation to controlling solid waste? Okay, all right, so they do, in addition to that's provided by the commission, the DENR can also provide and probably actually do provide technical and other capability building assistance. Okay, so this would not necessarily be one and the same as that provided under the commission. These are things that they do under their mandate as an agency, not under the commission, but as a government agency. They do have a mandate to provide this service. Okay, and the target audience for this service are the local government units. Right. What else? All right, this is an interesting power that the law gives the DENR. Okay, since they're the primary or the lead agency, they are also responsible for enforcing. Okay, as they are given those powers. And one of the additional powers given to them by this law is that of visitorial powers. Okay, and think of those as the ability to, visit any entity, any entity that may possibly be subject to violations of provisions of this law. So, the visitorial powers allows them to do, for example, spot checks. Okay. And cite people that are not in compliance. So that's a kind of a very interesting power, at least as it relates to the subject of this course. I would imagine that there'll be some investigators that would be involved as members of the party that does these visits. Okay, so what else would we find relative to the powers and functions of DENR? Okay, they also do issue rules and regulations to effectively implement the provisions of this act. So rules and regulations, so that speaks to setting parameters on what is a lawful or an unlawful activity. In other words, they have the power to define offenses in violation of the mandates of this law. So those would probably be found, those rules and regulations would actually not probably, but highly likely would be found in department administrative orders, excuse me, or DAOs. Okay, so that's that. This is a very, very short list of the many powers and functions of the DENR in relation to controlling solid waste. So let's move on to the next on our list, and that's the local government units. The law reiterates what is widely known in their, as to their responsibility in governance, overall governance. Okay, so as it pertains to controlling solid waste. Okay, they are primarily responsible for the implementation and enforcement of this law. Okay, this Ecological Solid Waste Management Act. Okay, they're primarily responsible for its implementation and enforcement. Okay, but it's specific, obviously, to their respective jurisdictions. Okay, so naturally, the governor, his or her jurisdiction would be the province, and the mayors would either have a jurisdiction over a municipality or city, depending on which they are mayors of. And same goes for the barangay officials. In fact, this law even specifies who between the barangays and the mayors would play in relation to specific activities related to controlling solid waste, namely segregating and collecting. Okay, so let's take a look at it. Okay, the law says that when it involves biodegradable, compostable, and reusable waste, the primary responsibility of segregating and collecting those solid wastes are to be conducted at the barangay level. Okay, but if the solid waste, the subject solid waste are non-recyclable materials and special waste, in those cases, the responsibility falls with the mayor of the city or municipality. Okay. Next on our list of institution is actually, it appears as one bullet point, but there are really two entities that we are, or at least two levels of entities that we are referring to. Okay. They are, specifically, they are solid waste management boards. Okay. But there are two levels that are included in this one bullet point. You have one at the provincial level and then the second one at the city/municipality level. Okay. But essentially they serve the same function. They only differ in their jurisdiction. Okay. And insofar as what that function is, it's really this. Okay. Their primary purpose, I mean, they have other roles and other functions and responsibilities pertinent to, controlling solid waste. Okay, but the very basic sense, the very basic function and responsibility that they have, that I at least want to put focus on, is the implementation plan. Okay, the implementation plan for the safe and sanitary management of solid waste that is generated in their jurisdiction, the geographic and political jurisdiction. Okay, so there's two activities involved in that plan that they are responsible for. Naturally, the first is for them, to create it, to draft it. That's their, function. Initial function is to actually create this implementation plan. This goes to the commission for the commission's review and approval, and once it's ready to be implemented, they are then the board. They being the board, they are then the ones responsible for implementing it. And you might recall when we were talking about the responsibilities of the commission, among the things that they do, related things that they do, is to monitor the implementation of these types of plans. Okay, so there you have it. You have this very basic responsibility, and you have boards, multiple boards. There's one at each level, not literally one at each level, but you do, depending on, I mean, there's one for every province, right? And then you have one for every city and one for every municipality. Solid waste management boards for each of those particular jurisdictions that I spoke of. Okay, I hope that is clear. Let us now move on. I think at this point we're pretty much done with institutional mechanism. So we're going to move forward as quickly as we can so we can proceed to the next topic. And what we're going to discuss now is the comprehensive solid waste management program itself. Okay, the law provides some specifics, and we're going to pick and choose the ones that are worthwhile discussing, and that's what we're going to focus on. So again, we're done with the institutional mechanisms, so we're now going to move to the comprehensive solid waste management program. Okay, I think you will agree with me when I say that every program, in order for it to be effective, requires a good plan, right? There has to be some kind of a plan that provides for the means in making sure that it is effective at its goals. So there is no difference here. When we're talking about this solid waste management program, it has to be based on some plan, some comprehensive plan. Because as we've seen, this is kind of a really, really broad area. Okay, So there has to be a plan. And the question then is, what plan does it have? The plans that we're referring to here are the 10-year solid waste management plans. Okay, there is not necessarily just one plan. There is one for the entire nation, but there is also one for various locations. So there'll be a number of these plans. Okay, anyway, so there. So basically, when we're talking about this comprehensive solid waste management program, it gets its directions. It's basically its instructions on how to proceed from these management plans. Okay, these are, as we've said before, these are the blueprint on what the organizations that are mandated to implement, it's what they would use as their map, if you will, on how they're gonna basically reach the objectives. Okay, so anyway, the question though is, I said these are very, very comprehensive. So that's why the images that I use here to characterize them are big books. So they're very comprehensive. They cover a lot of things, and naturally putting them together it's not something that can be done quickly, and it's not one that can be done in a vacuum. And when I say in a vacuum, where you're not interacting with other entities that could contribute to developing an effective plan. So the question is, how does the law ensure that it's not done in a vacuum and that it is truly based on something, not just anecdotal data? Okay, and so the law provides for the way it can, that can be ensured. Okay, and it starts with the annual reports that are done by the DENR. We've said this before, that the DENR does annual status reports. Okay, they do this not just for solid waste, but you've heard when we were talking about clean water and clean air, they do it there also. These are again our annual reports. They're done here also for solid waste, and the purpose is to be able to assess the situation at that point in time, identify issues, opportunities, those sorts of things. Okay, so bottom line is these status reports provide some very valuable data, very valuable and current data. Okay, and since that is the case, they are the primary basis as to how the framework is to be developed. Okay, so that leads to the next question: how does these reports, how do they end up becoming part of that framework? Okay, well, again, these reports, they eventually get submitted to the commission, the National Solid Waste Management Commission, and that commission, as we've said, comprised of who's who in the government. Diba sabi natin there's 14 government agencies. The heads of many of these government agencies, in their ex officio capacity, in other words, it's part of their job, okay, as secretaries, heads of those particular agencies, it's part of their job to participate in this commission. So we've said when we were talking about institutional mechanism, obviously DNR plays in, they're the chairman. You have the secretary of the DILG also being a party to it, and a host of others, like I said. All right, so it's a very, very nicely organized. The composition is very varied, and they really do have entities that ensures that it is comprehensive in terms of its coverage. Okay, so anyway, so with this commission being the way it is, they're in the best position to actually develop that framework. And of course, they're not going to just base their decisions on their own personal, their area of expertise. They have to base it on something specific to this topic, and that's where the status reports of DNR comes into play. So taking that all together collectively, they are able to put together the National Solid Waste Management Framework. Okay, and that framework provides as the baseline. Okay, because again, it assesses the situation in the country, and since it has some starting points, a base that every entity that is tasked to prepare a management plan, that they're able to use this as a starting point. Okay, so they're not having to start from zero. Okay, so that answers that first issue I raised earlier. Where do they get their data? How do they proceed? Do they just pull it out of the air? And of course, the answer is no. They base it starting with this. They start with this as a starting point. They start with this framework. Okay. So having said that, naturally, that of course means that framework is something that is made available to the people that would be creating these plans, and these people that I'm referring to are the waste management boards. Okay, the waste management boards of the province, the city, or municipality. Okay, generally the composition, we've said this earlier, there's members of the local government unit, but there are other participants also. So it's a very, very diverse group, just as diverse as the commission, but diverse specific to the jurisdiction. So they're probably the best organized, the best to be able to come up with this solid waste management plan for their given territory. Okay, so anyway, so that's that. They're able to tap the framework, and from that they're obviously able to take a stab at developing a solid waste management plan. A key point is that they're not just going to base their drafting on the framework. The framework is just a starting point, as I've said a couple of times. Okay, they're naturally having to gather their own data given the circumstance in their geographic jurisdiction. So they gather whatever they can, they take what they can from the framework as the baseline, and collectively they are able to come up with a draft. Okay, a draft of a 10-year solid waste management plan. And basically that draft is what gets submitted back to the commission for the commission to review and approve. And of course, if the commission approves it, then that is the plan, the blueprint that the local boards are going to use to implement, because they're the ones that are mandated to implement. Okay, so that's kind of the flow. All right. A couple of points I want to make. If you read the law, you may notice that it almost seems to say that yung ginagawa ng DNR to create the status report is a one-time thing. It's only intended, a few months after this law was put into effect. Okay, and there's also some discussions, similar discussions about a one-time activity of the commission. Okay, so yun lang. I mean, that's the language of the law. It sort of says, to get this started, okay, the DNR has to do a status report, and it almost sounds like once they've done that and they're able to submit that to the commission, tapos na yung trabaho nila. And the answer to that, of course, is it doesn't end there, because the DNR does these status reports annually. Syempre, they're able to gather on a regular basis very valuable data, very current, valuable data. So it would only make sense that that data continues to flow to the commission. So there are decisions that can be made, perhaps to update the framework, okay, so that the local boards always have current information, okay, that they can use. Okay. The other, so again, this is even if the language of the law seems to say it's a one-time activity, surely these are ongoing interactions. There are ongoing synergies between these agencies. Okay. So anyway, the one thing I want to point out also is that the use of the framework is not the only service that these local boards would avail of from the Commission. Again, we've discussed it briefly in the institutional mechanism when we were talking about the powers and functions of the Commission. Basically, the other services that the local boards could avail of from the commissions involve not just policy, not just the framework, but assistance in a number of ways. There were some things that we mentioned. For example, capacity building or capability building programs. I didn't mention some funding, but there are also funding available. Okay, so bottom line is that there is an ongoing service outside of just policy making. So those services are services that the local boards can continue to avail of from the Commission. Okay, but I think the one thing I want to mention, which you might recall when we were discussing institutional mechanism, DNR also. So it's not just the Commission and the boards, but DNR also has some services specifically for the LGUs. Services that are above and beyond that provided by the Commission. So on their own, based on their mandate, they do provide some assistance to the local LGU. So you can see, there's a dynamic relationship between these bodies that allows them to continue to work together, and basically that allows the local boards the opportunity to ensure they have all that they need to produce comprehensive plans. Okay. The other thing I also want to mention is the plans are 10-year plans, right? That, of course, does not mean that they're going to wait. Everybody waits until that 10-year period expires before they check to see how successful it was. They're not going to wait that long. The law requires that there be some mechanism for checking on a regular basis, and the more common time frame for reviews is biannual. In other words, every other year. So after 2 years, every other year. So every 2 years. Okay, so there's a review that happens every 2 years, just to make sure that the plan, as it's being implemented, is continuing to be effective. Okay, so there, as you can see, medyo talagang comprehensive talaga itong plan na to. All right, and it's not a one-time. This flow that I showed here is not a one-time occurrence, but rather it's an ongoing thing. Those entities that we are looking at there are there. They're there specifically for this purpose, to control solid waste, and they're going to be there until the law says otherwise. And currently the law mandates them to be there and gives them responsibilities beyond just this flow. It's an ongoing thing that they're having to be involved in. All right, so that should, in essence, give you a high-level view of how the law ensures that the plan, the implementation plan, the management plan, which is implemented, is comprehensive, that it's holistic, it covers all aspects, and that there's a mechanism to ensure that there's regular checks, so that if there are any problems, they could be discovered early enough. Okay. So yeah, so you can sort of see that. So this should give you, I would say, at a high level, it should give you enough to know that Indeed, when they say it's comprehensive, it's pretty comprehensive. Okay, so with that said, I think we're done with this tab, and we should now be able to proceed to the next tab, activity-specific rules. In its aim to control solid waste, this law provided special rules for specific some particular activities as well as topics. So let's take a look at specifically what these activities and topics are and see what kind of rules may have been set for some of them. Okay, so there are about 8 that the law enumerated, and under each there are again special rules that it made provisions for. So let's take a look at a few of them. Let's start with the first one, segregation of waste. The law provides under section 21 that there is a need, and this is of course referring to the segregation of solid waste. Okay, the law specified that the LGUs are mandated. Okay, it is their mandate to evaluate alternative roles for the public and private sectors when it comes to essentially collection, of solid waste from them. Okay, so the roles that it's talking about is how they might best, be able to collect those solid waste from the public and private sectors. Okay, so in providing that mandate, it qualified that whatever outcome, whatever the LGU decides, it specifically states that there must be a, when it comes to segregation of waste, the actual act of segregating the waste, regardless of what the LGU decides on the role of the public and private sector. Okay, regardless of that, segregation of waste must always be done primarily at the source. Okay, so what that means is that regardless of the decision that the LGU makes on the collection from the public and private sectors, okay, by the time that collection is made, segregation should have already been done, because again, the collection is being made at the source. So the source is of course either the residence or the office of that public or private sector. Okay, so what this is saying is, again, regardless of what decision the LGU makes, by the time pickup is made, the solid waste should have already been segregated. In other words, all the cans in one container, the bottles in one container, paper in another container, the perishables on another, etc., etc., that kind of segregation. All right, so let's take a look at another. Okay, this one, let's take a look at composting. Okay, composting. Now this one, the rule that the law provided essentially just makes it so there is a standard that has to first be met, okay, in order that compost products may be commercially distributed. So before they are commercially distributed, these compost products must first meet the standard for organic fertilizers as set by the Department of Agriculture. So there would obviously be a need to reference the Department of Agriculture for that standard, and you would naturally do that to determine if this compost product is fit for commercial distribution. Okay, so again, the special rule provides for that. All right, so let's take a look at one more. This one, why don't we take a look at the one on incentives? Okay, it's a little different because it's not setting any specific rules on what you cannot do or what you need to have before you can do certain things. This one actually it sets the rule on what must be met before an incentive may be granted. Okay, so section 45 talking about incentives, and it says reward. Let's just read it. Rewards, monetary or otherwise, shall be provided to individuals, private organizations, and entities, including non-government organizations, that have undertaken outstanding and innovative projects, technologies, processes, and techniques or activities in reuse, recycling, and reduction. Said rewards shall be sourced from the fund herein created. So this just sets the rules on when that incentive may be granted and availed of. Okay. All right. So that should give us a general idea of these special rules on particular activities or topics. Okay, that the law needed to make provisions for. Okay, so I think we are now ready to move further along. Now, looking at the punishable acts, these provisions under Section 48, okay, they seem easy enough. They're very easy to read. They're very short, okay, and there's only 16 of them. So it looks like it's an easy task to be able to determine what the elements might be for each one of these provisions. It certainly seems that way, doesn't it? Okay, but let's just quickly glance at them. But I do want to. What we're seeing right now is 6 of the 16. So let's go to the second page because I want to home in on a number of them, and I want to discuss them a little bit. Okay. The provisions that I want to focus on are subparagraph 9, 10, and 11. Subparagraphs 9, 10, and 11. Okay. Let us quickly proceed and focus our attention on subparagraph 9, which is this one. Okay, if we read it, again, it looks pretty easy because it's a very short sentence. But again, if you read it, it's not something that quickly jumps out at you. The elements that don't quickly jump out at you. And there's some red flags here. Okay, it's telling us that by itself, it doesn't give us the total definition of what constitutes the offense. In fact, it's even referring to other sources for that information. Okay. Moreover, okay, to help us analyze, let's just quickly break it out real quick or dissect it. Okay. It's a short sentence, but if you read it, establishment or operation of open dumps as enjoined in this act, or closure of said dumps in violation of Section 37. So there's actually 2 parts to this very short sentence, right? The first part is establishment or operation of open dumps as enjoined in this act. And the second part is closure of said dumps in violation of Section 37. Okay? So let's go back to the first one. It says establishment or operation. That's the particular acts, right? The act of setting something up, establishing, okay? The act of operating, okay? The act of operating something. And the something here that you would be establishing or operating would be open dumps, okay? So that in itself already tells us, it's pretty conclusive. It's there's nothing more. Establishment or operation of open dumps, it's easily understood, right? But what complicates it, what makes it so it's not complete, it's not seeming complete, is that it's referring to a different source where you would find that source actually says it's prohibited. Okay, so being that that's the case, there's obviously a need to look for that source. Here it just says enjoined in this act or prohibited in this act, so it's referring to the entire law. That of course means we have to look at the entire law. All right. The second part is a little easier because it's not referring to the entire law. It's referring to specifically to a section, which is good. Okay, and for that second part, instead of establishing and operating, the act is closing. Okay, it's the closure of said dumps. Okay, so that's pretty clear. But again, it makes reference to a section in the law where we would find specifically the words that says that is not allowed. It's a violation. Okay, so let's first look at the first part and see if we could make sense of it. So because it's referring to the entire law, what I had to do basically is do a search, keyword search, using the keywords open dumps. Okay, so fortunate for us where everything is computerized, so we can just quickly throw in those keywords and the system will deliver for us what it finds in the law that we are looking at. And in doing that, I did find that there were 13 hits, and so I looked at every single one of those hits, and I did find the exact provision, the exact section that does say explicitly that this is not allowed. Okay, and coincidentally, it's section 37. Okay, so this now makes it easier for us because now we could refer to the same section for these two parts. Okay, so what I did then here is I copied that provision, and here it is. So let's now do our analysis. Okay, let's quickly read it. Prohibition against the use of open dumps for solid waste. That's the title. Okay, and the provision starts with, no open dumps shall be established and operated, nor any practice or disposal of solid waste by any person, including LGUs, which constitutes the use of open dumps for solid waste, be allowed after the effectivity of this act. Okay, so there in what we just read, we're seeing that the specific acts are, again, the act of establishing and operating open dumps. It explicitly said that you cannot do that. You cannot, you cannot establish or operate. In addition to that, it also says that you cannot dispose of solid waste. Okay, whether you're a member of the LGU, or just a regular average person, the act of dumping, the act of disposing of solid waste, into an open dump site constitutes the use of open dump site, okay, which is not allowed. All right, so there you have it. That first part talks of 3 specific acts that are not allowed, right? But we didn't find anything in what we just read that talks about closing a dump site, as to whether it's illegal or not. Okay, so and if you read the entire paragraph, the entire section, you're still not going to find anything that talks of closure as an unlawful or prohibited act. So how do you proceed then in finding an answer for that? Well, in cases like these, you'd have to just read the provision itself and try to understand it without regard to a particular keyword that you might be looking for. Okay, because it may already be telling you something that addresses what it is that you're looking for. So, that's precisely the case here, because, after what I just read, where it says, establishing and operating nor using open dump sites are allowed, right? It goes on to clarify that the effectivity of that prohibition is based on the effectivity of this law. So effective, when this law was put into effect, it became unlawful to establish, operate, and use a dump site, an open dump, rather. However, there is a proviso, right? It says, provided that within 3 years after the effectivity, LGU shall convert open dump sites into controlled dumps. So in other words, there is an exception. Okay, there is an exception where those open dump sites could still be used, and that exception is only good for 3 years from the effectivity of this law. Okay, so for 3 years after this law was put into effect, you could still dump, controlled dump anyway. You could still use an open dump site, but in a controlled way. regulated by the local government unit. Okay, and it goes on to say that for another 2 years, a total of 5 years. It says on here that a total of 5 years reckoned from the start, or reckoned from the effectivity of this law. Okay, on the fifth year, the day after the 5th year. Okay, those controlled open dumps were completely closed. Okay, so what that means is from that point forward, the day after the 5th year, open dump sites are completely closed. They're completely prohibited. You can no longer, well, you couldn't anyway. You couldn't you couldn't establish or operate, but for some time you were allowed to use them. But starting on the day after the 5th year, no more. You couldn't use it anymore. Okay, so with that message, it's essentially telling us that whether you are establishing, operating, dumping into dump sites, or even in this case closing dump sites, okay, regardless of what it is that you're doing with dump sites, dump sites are no longer legal. So what that essentially means is it's moot, right? So we don't have to be looking for this, closure of said dump sites as a provision that is prohibited. Bottom line is no more dump sites starting in 2005, the day after 2005. Okay, so that answers that question. All right, so let's move on to the other provisions, because the other provisions also are similar to this in that it requires a little bit more analyzing. The way they're put together, they seem simple enough, but they do require a little bit more of an analysis. Let's pull them up at the same time. The manufacture, distribution, or use of non-environmentally acceptable packaging materials. And then the second one is importation of consumer products packaged in non-environmentally acceptable materials. Okay, so they're short and sweet, and they seem rather easy to understand. But you could easily miss, essentially the one thing that distinguishes whether those acts are unlawful or not. Okay, let's say you're surveilling someone, and this someone you're suspecting is a manufacturer, a distributor of, let's say, candy. And he or she obviously uses packaging materials for the candy that he manufactures and distributes. The question then, in order for you to conclude that he is committing a crime in violation of this provision, is his packaging materials, are they environmentally acceptable? How do you know if it's environmentally acceptable, right? So you have to look into that. And like what we did in subparagraph 9, where we took open dumps as a keyword, I also did the same thing here. You actually have to do something like this. Using non-environmentally acceptable as the keyword, I went into the law to see if there's anything there that qualifies what non-environmentally acceptable is. What are the parameters that constitutes something to be non-environmentally acceptable? So the search also produced a number of hits, namely I think there were 9 that it found, and there were 2 particular provisions that made the most sense. One specifically, and that specific one is the one that we're going to focus on right now, and that one is referring to the powers and functions of the Commission. Remember the Commission? Okay, Section 5. So it talks about exactly what powers and functions the Commission has, and one of those powers and functions is to formulate and update a list of non-environmentally acceptable materials. Okay, so they are the ones that come up with the criteria, and they're also the ones that maintain the list of the items that are non-environmentally acceptable. Therefore, you could just conclude that you just need to have access to that list, right? To see if the guy that you're surveilling if the material that he's using to wrap his candies with, if it's in that list, okay? And if it is, then there you have it, right? He's violating this provision of law, right? Sure enough, that's really, you know, as easy as it gets, right? But the one thing that you have to just keep in mind here is that, and I'm going to refer, I didn't have it on here on the screen, but I'll just refer to it. The second provision I found under non-environmentally acceptable is the one that talks about due process, you know, in relation to this list that the Commission maintains. What that means is that if there is a material that looks to be non-environmentally acceptable based on the criteria that's set by the Commission, they don't just automatically add it. Okay? They give whoever is affected due process to try and duke it out, right? So they do provide, as part of standard due process, notice and hearing. So there's notice that a hearing is going to be held, so that if anybody has any arguments, opposing, the act of adding something to this list, then they have the opportunity to do that. All right. So anyway, having said that, what you would need to do then is you don't just go and look for this list, but you look for the list that has undergone that due process of notice and hearing, and you know for a fact that this is the published one. Okay, it's the authoritative one. That way, when you cross-reference it against what you're investigating, and you've concluded that it's the materials that are being used are indeed on that list of non-environmentally acceptable, you can say with certainty that this person is in violation because that he's manufacturing, distributing non-environmentally acceptable packaging materials, right? But remember, you have to use that authoritative source. Okay, otherwise, it may not be conclusive that the violation is indeed a violation. Okay, so there you have it. I'm going to leave the rest of the provisions for you to play with, exercise with. I think there's a few more that are a little like this. So I would suggest, playing around with taking a look at the entire list of 16 and seeing if you could make sense of them the same way that we did on this exercise. All right, so anyway, I think we're pretty much done with this law. And just the same, I think we're pretty much done with this lesson. And also, being that this is the last of the 2 lessons under Brown laws, we are essentially done with Brown laws. Okay, so I think at this point I'm going to close off, say goodbye, and I look forward to talking with you again on the next module, module number 4. Until then.